Welcome to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie on KMPT and 930KMP.com. Good morning, Arnie. How are you?
You know, Scott, I'm a little agitated this morning.
Okay, what's going on with you?
I was had a restless night, and I was thinking, and I came to the conclusion that the Internet is evil.
Really?
I really think the Internet is evil. You know, it was created to be a global network of interconnected computer networks, you know, to link billions of devices together. You know, and so we could have this tremendous, capability to share information and all sorts of things. And I was thinking last night, can you imagine 200-300 years from now, some aliens come and land on Earth, and they start looking back at the history, and they find this Internet, and they pull it up, and they start looking at what we were using it for, and they find out that it was mostly used for sharing cat pictures and pornography. You know, when I really think about it, that's, 15% of all Internet traffic is cat pictures, and probably another 15 or 20%, is pornography. And it just seems to be a waste of a fantastic device, a fantastic tool.
But what are you thinking?
What I'm thinking is that we need to have a more cogent understanding of the purpose and effect of this, or at least people have to, not have to smarten up instead of being dumbed down. Recently, Carly Fiorini's presidential campaign has gotten a lot of Internet traffic based on the fact of whether a hot dog is a sandwich or not.
That's idiotic.
Given all of the topics, all of the concerns that this country is facing, the biggest amount of Internet traffic related to her campaign is whether a hot dog is a sandwich or not. So let me ask you, is a hot dog a sandwich?
No. A hot dog is a snack food. It's not even a meal.
Well, apparently it's gotten to the point where recently the Buffalo Bills had a discussion about this as well. I agree with you. In fact, in 2006, the Boston courts heard a case, and they ruled that a sandwich has to include 2 slices of bread. So it eliminates tacos and burritos, and apparently it would eliminate hot dogs.
Wait, hold on one second, though. You could actually claim a bun is 2 slices of bread.
I know. See, you're going to fall into the trap.
Connected by a spine of bread.
I know, but that's not what I said. 2 slices.
2 individual slices.
2 slices. That's what the courts ruled, and I'm holding to that definition.
You know what? One thing I want to mention, though, we're both from the city. We're both from New York, okay?
Originally, yes. Many, many years ago. A long meandering trail that has led me away from New York.
And me too. But here's the thing, okay? You and I both know the use case of grabbing a hot dog when you're on the run in the city out of a street cart is what you do.
Part of life.
It's part of life. It's what you do. Right. It's like, hey, I can't go get a real meal. I'm going to go get a hot dog on my way to the
taco, burrito, all that. But the question is whether it was a sandwich or not.
There are no taco burritos on the street in New York.
Well, there are now. You haven't been back. They have all those carts on 57th Street that have shawarmas and all sorts of
street meat,
street sandwiches.
I call it street meat, halal. I got it.
Yeah, you got it. But that's not really what I wanted to talk to about today. We had Let's zero back in. As you know, Scott, I'm an international man of mystery. Not really, but I have traveled and worked in more than 100 countries.
Yes.
I spent more than a decade working in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, and had the first private consulting practice in post-Soviet Russia. So I have a pretty good understanding of Russia. But I still have to ask, what is Putin up to? There's a lot going on with Russia in Syria, in the Ukraine. Recently, he was chosen or selected as the most powerful man in the world as a result of this, chest beating and I guess aggressive stature that Russia has taken in the rest of the world. And so, I think it's appropriate to kind of ask that question. What are they up to? What's going on there? There's been a long history. One of the things that I was involved in that I consider one of the highlights of my career, my non-radio career, was I had a chance to spend time with Edward Shevardnadze, who was the advisor to Gorbachev when Gorbachev was president of Russia, and he also became president of the country of Georgia. And I was there meeting with him in Georgia as president of Georgia.
What were the years again?
This is about a decade ago. Okay. I mean, he's passed away since. And I asked him the question of whether or not, what was the deciding factor? When did you know that the Soviet Union was going to come to an end? When did you? Because it happened under the Gorbachev era.
Right.
They had perestroika, and then things started to move in a democratic direction, and then it led to the era of Yeltsin. And so I asked Shevardnadze a question: when did you personally, understand? And he said there was one event that took place. He said he was sitting in the office in the Kremlin with President Gorbachev, and they were listening to Ronald Reagan do his what was referred to as his Star Wars. Talk about the Star Wars system, which was officially, I think, called SDI. It was called the Strategic Defense Initiative.
What was it in a nutshell? What was Star Wars again?
We were going to in the Reagan era in the 80s. We were going to put together a network of satellites that could shoot down missiles.
Right,
and it was particularly designed to target Soviet missiles.
Right.
And Shevardnadze told me he and Gorbachev were listening to the speech, and it was being translated. And in the speech, they started writing down what it would cost the Soviet Union at that time to build something to counteract that. Mm-hmm. And he said they wrote down all the things that they would have to do, and they added it up, and they looked at each other and realized they didn't have enough money. They could not raise enough revenue. There was not enough resources to counteract what was being proposed. It was never implemented, but it was threatened to be implemented. Sure. And that led them to, I think he said, a realization that they could no longer compete. But I want to really move a little bit more into getting more of a Russian perspective on this, and to help us better understand Russia today and Putin in particular.
Sure.
We have a very unique guest, Dr. Vadim Levitin. I've known Vadim for a long, long time. He went to medical school in what was the Soviet Union. He went to the most prestigious medical school there. And like all young men in the Soviet Union at that time, this is in the 70s, he had to serve in the military. So he was an officer in the Soviet military. He immigrated to the United States as a young man when Jimmy Carter helped open the door to, when he was president, opened the door for immigration to the United States. He immigrated here. He could not speak a word of English. Came to the United States without being able to speak a word of English, and he went on to he's gone on to a very successful career in the United States. So I think we want to bring him on to get a little bit different perspective on what's going on in Russia today.
I am looking forward to it. I can't wait to welcome Dr. Levitin. You are listening to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie on KMPT. After the break, Dr. Vadim Levitin. All right, we're back with What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie on KMPT and 930KMPT.com. Who's on our phone, Arnie?
It's Vadim Levitin. Vadim, привет, как дела?
Спасибо. I think that ends up our Russian language.
That's enough for Russian for our listeners today. We've been talking a little bit about the former Soviet Union and Russia and Putin being a strong man, and I didn't even share with the audience my experience in meeting Putin, but we were talking about the Star Wars defense and the downfall of the Soviet Union and how that may have played a critical role in all of that. But I think you have an argument that the Beatles had just as much to play in the downfall of the Soviet Union as Ronald Reagan and Star Wars.
Oh, absolutely. Who doesn't know the coming back to USSR song? But also all of the Russian elite, even Putin himself, are very fond of Beatles and Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin. As you know, those are the people they keep inviting to celebrate their anniversaries at the Kremlin.
And what was it about that music coming, finally leaking in to the Soviet Union that had a dramatic effect on things?
It's not only music. I think the changes were dramatic, and they were, cultural and economic. People kind of stopped being afraid because after Stalin died and Khrushchev kind of had a little warming up of the environment in the country, people were less afraid. So during Brezhnev times, no one was really afraid. It was a relatively simple life with everyone knowing the rules, and as long as you were willing to play the game, you were pretty safe. No one is really arresting you. So when you have kind of a liberalization of sorts. People get more information. People started going to foreign countries. They started, sharing experiences and understanding that maybe Soviet Union was not the most paradisic and the most perfect place on earth to be in.
Right.
And so it kind of led to a gradually cultural corruption and dissent.
This is...
In fact,
Well, what's interesting about this is a common story I've heard with Eastern Bloc countries back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Václav Havel, credits Frank Zappa and the Velvet Underground for liberating the people of Czechoslovakia. Here you have the Beatles and Led Zeppelin. So Western culture, at first being bootlegged, and then being accepted in...
Cultural aggression, as they used to refer to it as.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, in addition to this, as you know, most of the young generations in any society, they have a certain period of nonconformist attitudes. And they were definitely the generation born, equivalent to baby boomers in the United States. And that was a relatively nonconformist people who... explored other things, and they liked other music, and they liked other things, and they wanted to travel, and they wanted to say whatever they felt like.
Right.
So it kind of gradually led to that.
Why did you and your family decide to leave? I mean, you came to the United States. No one in your family spoke English. You're going to a country that you didn't know much about. Why did you make that? And it was a daunting experience at the time and process to leave the country. Why did you make that decision?
Well, actually, I don't know about the language. I'm now illiterate in many languages, including English. But I think that we're probably a little bit an unusual family. It wasn't an economic migration by any means. My family was pretty well off, within the constraints of Soviet society, of course. It was more of a kind of really our inability to imagine how we're going to be living there forever and ever after, a few centuries of my family being there. And so what happened is that I'm the youngest in the family, and I kind of rebelled. And I said, well, I'm leaving. And so it kind of prompted the entire family get up and move.
When I spent, as you know, I spent a decade traveling back and forth, maybe 20 days a month in from 87 to 97. It seemed in that transition period, things were, friendly. Americans were liked. Obviously, that was the pre-Putin era. Now it seems like it's a much more hostile, toxic environment. Is that your take on it?
Yes, I was there in 2007 last time at the UN conference, and it was positively just not tolerable for me to even be there. And I had a post in Eastern Europe at the time to work for the United Nations, and I actually told my friends that I had to leave because it was kind of suffocating to be in Moscow, the city where I was born, which hasn't been the case in the 90s when you and I both worked there. No, I think that this country goes through those swings between being Asian empire and being European civilized society. It started probably with Peter the Great. That was the big Western swing. And it's also a society that is primarily afraid of themselves. They're not really afraid of the United States. They're not afraid of China that much anymore. They haven't historically been afraid of much because it is still the largest country.
What do you mean
planet.
by afraid of themselves? What does that mean?
Well, if you kind of trace throughout the history, Peter the Great, when he was 10 years old, he became, the ruler, together with his half-brother. And it started with the rebellion. It started with a revolution, actually. So he witnessed it from the beginning, and it was a turmoil always. And this is the governing bodies of the country were always being afraid of their own country. They are now. Of
acquiring too much power. You're saying of the government having too much power, too much rule, and it being more constricted.
Yeah, it's a very unruly, large empire. And so basically their paranoia and fear leads to controlling monarchs like Peter the Great and leads to people like Putin historically. Last time they had a nice, decent kind of a British king who was Nicholas II. obviously, he wasn't strong enough. Most of the Russians would tell you that. He wasn't strong enough to survive, and he and his family got killed. And so it's kind of natural for them to gravitate towards someone who, not only presents a certain image like Putin does. I'm such a tough guy, which he isn't. But that's the cultivated kind of image of a very strong man running the place. And it appeals to certain groups of population, but it also helps to control that huge unruly country.
Right.
It's really not as perfect as they try to portray it at the moment.
We could only imagine what perfection looks like over there. When we come back, from our break, we're going to pick up more with Dr. Vadim Levitin right after this. All right. We're back with What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie on KMPT and 930KMPT.com.
So, Vadim, I've read recently that there's concern about the World Cup being in Russia because of the hostility of the crowds, and there was a story in the New York Times about recounting how when minority players on other teams are at the soccer games, they chant monkey and throw bananas at them. There's swastikas in the stands. Is that reflective of the environment that Putin has allowed to ferment in Russia?
Oh, I think he's initiated it and promoted it. Absolutely, it is especially kind of puzzling to at least to some of my friends and including me, is that at least in the Soviet Union there's a certain level of belligerence against the United States, Great Britain, Western powers, because it was a competing ideology. At least it had a point, if you will. Now there's really no competing ideology. So basically, the last time I was there, all I saw is just belligerence for the sake of belligerence. It wasn't really, they don't have any particular issue. There's really no ideology to speak of. There's no competition. It's just made up. But it certainly, I think it was initiated by people who control the media, and people who control the media are the Putin guys.
So is the popularity polls that show him, wildly popular, is that accurate or false?
Well, I think that I'm not sure I can prove whether it's false or accurate, but what we all know is that all of the TV stations and most of the media and most of the newspapers, most of the magazines are controlled by the Putin's elite, which is one of the first things he did, actually, when he came to power. So since if everyone is watching Channel 1, let's say, which is the most popular channel there on television, and according to Channel 1 poll, he's like 80% popular, then yeah, probably out of the people who are watching Channel 1, he might be 80% popular, but no one really knows. I sincerely doubt that kind of popularity. Russians in general are not really that compliant. As I said, that's why he's really mostly afraid of his own people. Most of the times what we see people, St. Petersburg, Moscow, large cities. But it's a huge country. It is, it's 11 time zones. So if you go all the way to Chelyabinsk or Vladivostok, I'm not sure he's that popular, and I'm not sure what's going on there. And in fact, I'm not sure anyone is.
So in the case of the posture of Russia towards Ukraine and now more recently Syria, is it part of some master plan, as some people suggest, or is it there's no plan at all in relation to it, as others have suggested? What's your take?
Of course there is a plan. I think that's kind of naive to think that they act without any plan. There's a certain attitude and certain strategy, and there's certain agenda that they're trying to accomplish.
Which is?
And that includes, well, there are many items in the agenda. Last time they called to consult me on whether they should adjust their agenda. I would say that they don't really need Ukraine or Crimea. So historically, Russia was actually started as a country with many different kingdoms. One was Kiev Kingdom, Novgorod Kingdom. So it was many different kingdoms with every little kingdom having its own little king. And then at some point, after they were conquered by Genghis Khan, and after their liberation 100 years later, they decided to unite. And so it's kind of in the psyche of the country that they should all be united. And so historically, I think it's not even Putin. I think that historically kind of the tendency to go back and unite into a larger empire would probably be one of their drivers. That's as far as Ukraine and other countries who are nervous, and they should be nervous.
So if you're advising a U.S. presidential candidate on what our posture ought to be towards Russia and Putin, what would your suggestions be?
My suggestion would be to, well, it depends on which candidate we're talking about. But my suggestion would be to articulate United States foreign policy and stick to it, rather than trying to, in some kind of, have an influence over the Russian foreign policy, because that's kind of a difficult thing to accomplish. So we should have our own agenda, and we should pursue that agenda. With Russia, without Russia, it doesn't really matter.
Right. So the pendulum, like you said, swings one way and then the next. So when do you see it swinging back away from this kind of oligarchical, right?
I mean, what happens after Putin? I mean, he's not going to live forever.
Right.
So what happens next?
I'm not even sure it's personality-driven. I think that whatever happens after he's gone, sooner or later, I believe the society will gravitate towards another controlling totalitarian style of leader. And if it doesn't, then they will probably have turmoil and revolt and another series of revolutions.
Is that partially, not only were there many kingdoms, there's more than 160 minority groups in Russia, and obviously they have different agendas and have different loyalties, and they have different desires, and it's hard to govern that kind of environment.
I would say that I always thought it was impossible. I mean, case in point, you could go to the Tatar Republic, which is mostly Tatars, mostly Muslims, and mostly locked inside in the middle of Russia. If you go there today, it is pretty much an independent country, although it is part of Russia. So Putin isn't really governing anything there. He's just complying with whatever the president of Tatar Republic does.
Wants to do. Hey, Vadim, with our remaining 30 seconds, tell us what you're working on now, how we can get in touch with you, how our listeners could find out what you're up to.
Well, I do a lot of things now. I do a lot of consulting. I'm on the board of some organizations in Europe. I work for the United Nations and do some projects for them. They can contact me by email. That's vdm.levitin@gmail.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Vadim Levitin. And you are listening to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie. This is Scott Richmond.
This is Arnie Sherman.
You're listening to What Do You Know on KMPT.
As you know, Scott, I'm an international man of mystery. Not really, but I have traveled and worked in more than 100 countries.
Yes.
I spent more than a decade working in Russia, in the former Soviet Union.
Arnie, when did you notice the change? What year was that?
There was actually a seminal event that happened in 1987, where it was the first time I noticed that things were starting to change. And all the previous visits and meetings, when we would ask if there's anything we could work on together, if there's anything we could collaborate on, was there ways in which we could move forward together, they'd always say, no, we can handle everything, we don't need any help.
Right.
We don't want any help.
Gave you the Heisman.
Right, exactly. And we had a meeting in 1987 with the Ministry of Transportation, and there was a fellow from the largest U.S. railroad, and he asked a question about is there anything we can work on together, and literally the person we were talking with ran out of the room, came back with a list, and started saying, we have problems with cistern waste on the railroad. Right. Can you help us with that? We have railway stabilization problems. Do you have equipment? And it really was a single event that showed me that there was a change in attitude and that we could move forward together. And it also led to my beginning to work there, because I had built some relationships, and that very railway company asked me if I would help them figure out how to work in that market.
I'm curious, what did he go out of the room for? Was he out for a while, or was it to get permission? He
ran out of the room and came back with a list, an actual piece of paper.
Wonder why I didn't bring it into the meeting.
Because up until that point, it was very rare that I was expecting the standard response.
Right.
When Brad was his name, Brad asked a question. I knew from every experience they were going to say, we're fine. We don't need any help from you, right, Americans. And this guy said, wait one moment, and he ran out and came back with a list.
Incredible.
It was carbon paper. It was a carbon paper sheet that had things on it. One of the things that I learned over there when we were talking about, are we the two big superpowers? One of my personal experiences where I realized we were not at the same level and the U.S. was more advanced is they would take us on trips and to visit all factories and bottling plants to show their technological sophistication.
Right.
And I'll never forget visiting a champagne factory, and every single bottle that came off the assembly line had a different level. The bottles were filled to a different level, and I realized they had no calibration equipment and couldn't calibrate. And there was a big discussion going on about whether their nuclear missiles could pinpoint, and I realized that they did not have the sophistication at that time that we had. That we had moved significantly ahead of them in all aspects of technological development at that time in the 80s.
So 1987 forward, then you started to keep on going back, and the meetings became more frequent, and, and a lot of accomplishments happened, right? You were accomplishing a lot with them.
Right. We opened an office. I had the first private representational practice in Soviet Union and then in post-Soviet Russia, and we helped Marriott do hotels, and we built the Trans-Siberian Railroad joint venture project between U.S. shipping company Sealand, is now Maersk Sealand, and the Russian Ministry of Transportation. We did work for a number of Fortune 50 companies who were trying to figure out how to enter that market as it was opening up to Western participation. We helped the U.S. government move humanitarian aid into the country. All those things started to happen in the late 80s, and by 1990, I had an office in Moscow with 16 full-time people doing this kind of work, helping companies and organizations work in the marketplace.
When we come back, I want to talk to you a little bit about Boris Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev, and I want to get your personal opinions about them and your remembrances. We'll be right back. This is Scott Richmond.
This is Arnie Sherman.
You're listening to What Do You Know on KMPT. Arnie, tell me, late 80s, now you're there a lot, and you're spending a lot more time in Russia.
I had an apartment 3 blocks from the Kremlin on Tverskaya Ulitsa, Dom 6. I had the apartment that was Brezhnev's translator's apartment. It had a double living room and a piano in it. He had moved out of the country. He had moved to Poland. He was allowed to leave, and he kept his property and rented it out, and I got it. So I actually, at the time, had one of the best apartments in the entire city of Moscow.
You were rolling big.
Right across the street where they built the first McDonald's. Yes, I was living.
So let me ask you a question. So heads of state. So you started to mingle and get to know the heads of state. Give me some remembrances about that in the years.
Well, again, in the late 80s or early 90s, when I was chairman of the American Center, I would go over and co-host conferences and dialogues, and we'd have the members of the Politburo, the leaders of the country. We had my co-host in one of those events was Madame Tereshkova, the first woman in space, the first Soviet cosmonaut that flew into space. Had meetings with the mayors of the major cities and all of their deputies. As I mentioned, we brought Boris Yeltsin to the United States the first time.
Right.
I had dealings with Putin before he was president of the country when he was working in St. Petersburg.
What was he like, by the way, then?
KGB agents don't lose their spots very.
Sure.
I always had a very different opinion than George Bush had of him. Remember, George Bush used to say he's a guy I could look in the eye and know I could do business with.
Right.
He was a guy that you could look in the eye and know that you didn't want to turn your back on him. That was my experience dealing with him. Very abrupt, very, he would fit the stereotype of a KGB operative, which is what he was trained as.
Right.
You have to remember, in that period of time, these folks that were trying to struggle with, perestroika, which was the transition, they were all raised and had all of their experience in the Communist Party.
Right.
Boris Yeltsin was a member of the Politburo of the Soviet Union Union. He was a member of the Politburo of the city of Moscow, and he was thrown out. But that's where all of his experiences were up until the time he was 60 years old. So he struggled, as all of them did, with what does it really mean to be, a democracy, or how do you open this can of worms slowly?
Right.
And to some respect, as Vadim had indicated earlier, they were not in control of the opening of the can. The can was opening because you couldn't block out communications anymore, the internet and cell phones. I mean, they were hearing and integrating with the rest of the world and seeing what everybody else has. And the greatest motivator to a society is to see what everybody else has, and if you don't have it, you want it.
Right, of course.
And if you're being talked about as being a superpower, they realized they weren't. They weren't living like that. In the 50s, we were maybe, after World War II, the United States had suffered a lot of losses. There was a lot of contribution to the war effort. Maybe in the 50s, we were close to being similar in terms of what a middle-class family in both societies would be like. But by the time the 80s came along, it was completely different. In Moscow, a family of four would live in a 400-square-foot apartment and share a kitchen and a bathroom with four other families. It was a totally different lifestyle. It wasn't even a word in their vocabulary for privacy. There was no privacy in that society.
So when they started to get freedoms and they said taste freedom and they started to taste living, kind of in a more open society.
And a peek at what everybody else was doing. And they didn't have to look at the United States. They just had to go to Finland. You could take a train into Finland, and Finland was a beautiful country with beautiful, restaurants and beautiful stores and beautiful shops. In the 80s, you would walk into the #1 department store in Moscow, Gums, and there would be basically underwear and Victrolas. But I don't even think people would...
Two things you need.
Yeah, Victrolas. That would they would sell. There would be nothing you would want to buy. People would always ask me to bring things back for them. The only things we ever brought back were vodka and caviar. That was the only things we could bring back.
Tell me a little bit about that. The parties and the Russian kind of way of life, especially when they started to taste freedom and invite guests in. They are known to be, heavy partiers relative to vodka.
Well, it was a staple of society. I mean, there are kiosks in the parks in Moscow, even to today, where you could run out. And those hospital-sized plastic containers you get with the tear-off tops for orange juice?
Yes.
They would sell vodka in those for $1 each. So you could run out quickly at lunchtime and, take a pop or two before you went back to work. It was, they didn't have nightclubs and restaurants early on. I mean, up until the late 80s, they drank a lot, and commiserated. We would go when we would take train rides. I loathe taking train rides because your Russian partners or your Russian comrades on your trip would come into your train car with bottles of vodka that had tear off tops. There was never a Russian vodka bottle that you could put a top back on, because they would say, "Well, why do you need to put the top back?
Finish it."
And they would come in and stay in your car until the bottles were empty. And that was I'm not a drinker, and that was a grueling experience to go through that on a regular basis.
A carton of milk.
So once some of the intelligentsia and some of the high level folks, just like in any country, it wasn't the average person that became big partiers. I mean, a teacher in Russia still only makes $300 or $400 a month. Mm-hmm. I mean, they don't, and things cost what they cost. They're not subsidized. You want to buy a car costs what a car costs.
Right.
You want to buy television, a television costs what a compuder. A thin layer got exposed. All of the billionaires. All of the oligarchs, as they call them now.
Right.
Those folks have this lavish international lifestyle, and once you get exposure to an unlimited amount of money, or what I used to call free money,
they're 1%, right?
Yeah, they just went on the deep end.
So, are you impressed with, or tell me, how fast things have actually changed there over the last 30 years? I mean, they pretty well, have they caught up to us?
No. It's like a movie set, a Hollywood movie set. If you go to Moscow, you go down the main street, the main boulevard, which is like Fifth Avenue or the Champs-Élysées in Paris. It looks nice. It's beautiful lights, and they put a mall and all that. You walk 5 blocks in, and they're rat-infested old apartment buildings. I mean, again, it's changed just like in China. There's tremendous wealth and opulence. There's a millionaires in China, but there's 1.3 billion people, and you go out to these, to the rural areas, and life hasn't changed. You go 400 miles from Moscow, and it's like it was in the 60s and 70s.
Incredible. All right. Well, look, when we get back, or we come back, we are going to talk to Arnie more about Russia and We will be back on What Do You Know on KMPT and 930KMPT.com. Thank you. We're back with What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie on KMPT and 930KMPT.com. Arnie, we're going to finish up with Russia. And you know what? I got to believe you have some great stories about things that happened over there while you were traveling as an expat.
Most of them I can't share on the radio, but a few of them I will. I'll tell you one interesting story. So we're out in the Russian Far East, and we're trying to get on an airplane. And it was very interesting in those days. It was very inexpensive to travel across the Soviet Union in rubles. It cost $3 or $4 to take a plane flight. So you'd buy a ticket if you were a Soviet citizen or a Russian, and then you go to the airport and you'd wait 4 or 5 days till there was a seat on a plane. People would be sleeping on the floors. If you were a foreigner in those days, you just show up at the airport whenever you want.
Right.
You pay the equivalent of about $150 US, and the police would escort you to the plane after it was full, and they would ask you, where do you want to sit?
Are you serious?
Yes, and you would point, and they would take somebody off the plane and put you on the plane. And it was so we had rules.
Talk about profiling.
We had rules in our company, like we would never separate mothers from children or husbands from wives or any of that sort of thing. All the passengers would get on planes before the crew would get on there, and they would leave them out on the tarmac all night long. And it was often so cold that I had this huge, heavy, big coat that I would wear, and it saved my life on a few occasions. The planes were so cold from being out in the Russian night that you couldn't touch any metal inside the plane without your fingers sticking to it.
Oh my God!
So you'd be sitting there freezing, and then the crew would finally come on. I was on a flight once when the pilot and the co-pilot both locked themselves out of the cockpit. Lucky the plane was on automatic pilot, or else I wouldn't be here.
How did they get back in?
With an axe. They broke the door down with an axe. I was waiting on a tarmac in the Far East to get on a flight, and there was a man with a goat on a leash. They was taking on the plane. They used to fill the planes up. I mean, they were death traps. You could take on as much luggage as you want. They would fill the aisles with bags and stuff, and all around you.
No FAA.
I always would I would sit always in the front row so you could get off the plane. I would never take a seat in the back. And they would let you bring live animals. So they would take a sheep from the Russian Far East and bring it to Moscow and sell it to make some money because the flights were inexpensive.
Did you feel safe? You couldn't have felt safe.
No, but I was young and foolish. But the police, the GAI, as they're called, came up, and for one day they decided that they're not going to allow live animals on the plane. So they go up to the guy and say, you can't bring a live animal on the plane today. And the guy says, why? And they say, well, it's just because you can't. So he took out a knife and slit the goat's throat.
On the plane?
No, on the tarmac.
On the tarmac.
And then he said, now he's not live. Is that okay? And the cop said, sure. And they wrapped him up in plastic and carried him on over his shoulder onto the plane.
What did they serve on those planes?
Apple juice. That was it.
Apple juice and cartons of vodka.
I once flew to Mongolia, and I flew first class on Air Mongolia. And the meal that they gave you on first class was apple juice, a hospital-sized container of that fruit cocktail, and an entire box of Ritz crackers. That was the first-class meal on
first class on Air Mongolia.
On Air Mongolia
is like steerage on United Emirates.
Yeah, during the transition period, I would have calls from Russian military trying to sell Russian military equipment. I once had a call and said, a Russian general would like to meet you, and I went to meet him, and he wanted to sell me an aircraft, an Antonov 225.
So let me ask a question then. So is the oligarchs, their goal, right, is to protect what they have, right?
Sure.
Greed is good here. I mean, not good, but it is what it is.
Gordon Gekko was, is their hero. They got I call it free money. They got their wealth from nothing. It wasn't like they had money and they went. What happened was in the 90s, one of the worst things that ever happened is that Harvard University helped the Soviet Union make the transition, and they had a thing called shock therapy, in which they were going to free fall into democracy. And I always said, looking back, that they should have had a little less shock and a little bit more therapy. And so what happened was they gave out vouchers so that everybody could own every business. That's what happened. So if you worked in a copper mine,
right,
you got a share in that copper mine.
Right.
And in return, the Soviet government stopped subsidizing these mines, so they had no income. Because the way the old system used to work is you got a budget to run your copper mine, you produce copper, you gave it to the government, and the government sold it. So it was like a not-for-profit organization.
Right.
All of a sudden, the government cut off giving any money. So these miners had shares but they weren't getting any salary. They weren't getting any paid. So the smart guys, many of them, former intelligence community connected guys,
Right.
would come in and say, Scott, I can pay you. But the only way I can pay you is if you give me that piece of paper that you got that's really not worth anything. And if I get enough of these papers, I can go to a bank and borrow money and pay you until we get ourselves operating. And you're a worker in a compromise. You gave them the shares.
Right.
So they would go and gather a majority of the shares. They would go to some German bank, Deutsche Bank. They get a valuation of the company, this big copper mine let's say it's worth $1 billion. They borrow $100 million on that $1 billion. They'd be all of a sudden the owner of it because they have all the stuff. The workers didn't understand how controlling interest work or
Right, of course not.
So all of a sudden they got $100 million. So they put $1 million back into the company to pay everybody and take the other $99 million and go buy everything else they could buy. So that's how all of these oligarchs, 9 or 10 or 12 of them, created so much wealth.
1%ers. This is their 1%ers, and it's totally less than 1%.
And as long as you pay your fair share, as long as Putin gets his fair share or his minions get their fair share, and you don't interfere in politics, you're allowed to operate.
He gets his VIG. Right.
He gets his VIG. Maybe he's the second or third richest man in the world right now.
Incredible. And he still has the nerve to wear no shirt and be on horseback and think that is the way to roll.
Well, he's appealing to this nationalistic fervor and fantasy. Not unlike a little bit what happens here. We have candidates that spur this, USA, and we're the tough guys, and we're going to run the world. They try to do the same thing. Putin's the tough guy. You've heard some of the candidates talk about how he kicks sand in our face. He's tougher than we are. Ironically, those same guys complain when they're asked hard questions at an interview,
right?
But it's a calculated strategy, and it feeds on people's nationalistic pride. Every country has it,
right? Well, it's interesting. We have a lot more to talk about when it comes to Russia. You've been listening to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie, and we'll be back next week. You're listening to KMPT and 930KMPT.com.